Well, we ran an article earlier this week, which is edging, of course, into the political. We've done a lot of political coverage here this year. And this one definitely has some political overtones, and it's one we're going to kind of sink our teeth into a little bit. The name of the article was "What the Trump Administration Misses About Regulations," and it initially ran on the Conversation website. It was written by a gentleman by the name of Joseph Aldi, who is an associate professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, a visiting fellow at the Resources for the Future think tank, a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So in other words, Mr. Aldi knows his stuff, and more than just a little bit. The article, as you would expect, is a very well-written and closely argued piece, offering some compelling evidence that when you really tally up all the economic and social costs and benefits, leaving business regulations in place may carry more value than rescinding them. It's interesting. Many people have made that point. And Aldi makes a good case here, but there are some interesting counters to this argument as well. So to help me sort through the various angles of the story, I'm joined now by Quality Digest CEO Jeff Dewar, coming to us from QD North in Seattle via Skype. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Mike, how you doing?
All right, how are you today?
From, cold and rainy Seattle.
Cold and rainy, Northern California too. I think it's cold and rainy and snowy probably in a lot of parts of the country today. Well, let's jump into this one. This is an interesting article with a lot of ramifications. I mean, the top line takeaway from all these pieces is that regulations are good, okay? Now, does that mean that businesses left to their own devices are inherently bad?
Well, no. I mean, regulations in many different forms are adopted voluntarily by companies and businesses. If you take a look at ISO 9001, that's very much a self-imposed series in some respects of regulations that companies voluntarily adopt. But granted, sometimes their customers force it upon them. And then even just a company's internal policies and procedures are, in a sense, a form of regulation. So it's nothing new. When the federal government comes along, you know, they're mandating it, so it's really not your decision anymore. And generally speaking, it's for the benefit of, society at large, rather than the way you adopt a regulation or a policy for your own particular benefit of your employees, your business, or your customers.
Well, I mean, this stuff comes down to money, obviously. I mean, the argument is that it's expensive for companies to maintain some of these regulations. Certainly a lot of the environmental regulations are costly for some companies in certain fields, certainly in the energy space. So, but the argument Aldi's making is that the societal benefits of that are so much greater that, you know, a few billion here or there for industry is a great expenditure if it kicks off many billions of dollars for society. You think that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he gives a great example in there, and if you can, Christopher, you can show that first slide. You know, he talks about the reduction from the EPA in 1990, the acid rain reduction program that was put into place to reduce the nitrous and sulfur oxides. Just a dramatic decrease over the last couple of decades, you know, and that program is estimated to cost industry somewhere around $2 billion. But the savings are to society estimated somewhere around $100 billion. So you're talking about a 50-to-1 return. And it's always, you can look at these things in a real sort of funny way, but you know, the way that they score these, in the Office of Management and Budgets and very much involved in coordinating this, is they cite many thousands of less cases of premature death, many thousands of less non-fatal heart attacks caused by known elements of acid rain. So there's a huge benefit to society here.
And yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, because when people get sick, there is a lot of cost to society. I mean, we're having a fight as we speak right now in the Congress about healthcare. And I mean, certainly people that get sick more cause more stress to the economy in terms of needing services. So yeah, it would make sense that there are some savings there overall for society that would come from strict regulations in industry.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions that comes up that makes it a little bit suspicious, especially in today's political environment, is that there's, you and I both know, as everybody who's watching this right now, we've at some point in our careers, probably many, many times in our careers, have been involved in justifying something, where we approach it not from, gee, will this be beneficial, but where we've already decided on an outcome. And then we go and backfill the justification for that particular known outcome. It's like that Japanese phrase that there's nothing more dangerous than a man with a hammer in search of a nail.
Right.
And I think that's part of the suspicion that surrounds it. Sure, you can, like Aldi comes up with this, cites this cost benefit of 50 to 1. But what about some of the other factors that might play into this, making it more difficult for other electric utilities to adopt new innovations that might reduce other things, that create new jobs, that create, synergy in the economy, and just a whole cascade of events or possibilities that aren't even considered in that cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah, and barriers to entry too. I mean, there certainly is a value to making it easier for businesses to be able to get into industry and be innovative. And maybe if those barriers were lower, their innovations on their own would lead to reduction in some of these harmful emissions and other bad societal outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also very helpful to sort of look at the perspective of history. If you go back and look at regulations, there's this feeling today that we've had this, like Vice President Pence talks about, this avalanche of regulations that's coming out of Washington. But if you look at what has happened from, say, 1970, and Christopher, if you can throw that slide up, you can see starting in 1970, there were roughly just slightly over 400,000 regulations, and they're not measuring regulations by this graph. This was by the Mercatus Center, part of the George Mason University in Virginia. What they're doing is they're counting up in the Federal Code of Regulations the number of shalls and musts and shall nots and all this, and and attaching the numbers to that. So in 1970, about just slightly over 400,000, and then in 2008, just when Obama came in, just in the mid 900,000, 963,000, I believe, and then it just kept on going for the last 8 years during Obama's time, at roughly the same rate, roughly about an additional 15,000 sort of edicts per year. So it actually has been on an increase, yes, but on a linear basis.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that, maybe you can throw that one back up there, Christopher, because I think there's an interesting thing to note here is this, I think, Jeff, is one example of bipartisanship in Washington. Because if you look there, you can see the red graphs and the blue graphs that goes up pretty much evenly the whole time, So this idea that Obama greatly increased the number of regulations. I mean, they increased, of course, but not really at a rate at which was unexpected based on what had come before. So that's bipartisanship. But I mean, there's some pros. I mean, I can look at this, and you and I can argue it either way. But I mean, I can look at this and say, well, you know what? I mean, maybe it's not the government's role to be involved in this stuff. Again, maybe the better way to do it is to encourage organizations through market forces or through other ways to comply. And I see a good point for that. I mean, sure, none of us really, I think many of us don't want a bigger government. We want businesses to be able to be as unfettered as possible. So there's some good arguments to be made for the fact that there are too many regulations. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it also brings into the discussion, how you want your government to treat you. It can give you an example, a very personal level. We have offices in Seattle and also in Chico, California. And when we rented or leased our offices there in Chico, we sat down with the landlord. We found the office complex that we wanted. and we had a kind of hard-boiled negotiation, and we scratched this out and lined this out and added this page and that, and we ended up with, I think, 13 pages, and we both signed, and that was it, and done. Then we also have an apartment in Chico, California, for traveling employees and company guests and so on, and we sat down, and there was a 1-inch thick sheath of papers of acknowledgement of the federal this and the Asbestos Act and the state of California this, and it was just an endless amount. And then the actual lease was just like 2 pages that said, here's how much you're going to pay and here's what the term will run to. So in a sense, they're saying the experience in right there highlighted, if you're a business, you're on your own, but if you're a really stupid, naive, helpless consumer, the government needs to step in and really take care of you in that regard. But the onus for all those regulations fell on the owners of that property. And I asked the property manager, how much time does it take you to shuffle through all this paperwork? And she's hours and hours a week. And and that directly affects the cost of running that business, and of course is passed on in the form of increased rents.
Muda. I mean,
Muda.
It's exactly Muda. I mean, you raised another point that we chatted about off air, this idea that half, I didn't realize it was this high, half of U.S. citizens require a CPA or some professional to help them do their taxes each year. And that's incredible.
I mean, it's just, it's what, there's a fellow at Johns Hopkins University, Mr. Tellis, he refers to everything that has to do with regulatory requirements, including the IRS, as basically it has amounted to a kludocracy. It's just a band-aids after band-aids after band-aids, because it's so you end up with this very kludgy system, and what happens is it's easier, because of the way our government is structured and the separation of powers and all this, that it's easier just to put a Band-Aid on top of a Band-Aid rather than just rip them all off and rewrite it with something clearer and simpler. And to your point, that our tax system requires roughly half of all our citizens to seek professional help, whereas in the UK, hardly anyone needs professional help at a personal level for their tax responsibilities.
Well, I'll tell you the truth, when I think about my taxes, I definitely seek professional help because it drives me crazy. But, it's, it's reality, that what you're talking about here. And back to Aldi's point, and back to the Trump administration's point, this idea that there's a 1 in, 2 out model where they're going to get rid of 2 regulations for every new one they create. In theory, I mean, that can make some sense. Aldi points out that, well, if these regulations, that the 2 that they get rid of are having societal benefits, not so good, because the new one may not come up to the level of those societal benefits. But, in theory, I mean, if you look at the individual regulations closely before you terminate the 2, maybe that can make some sense.
Yeah, I mean, it forces you to look at it and analyze it. He's just making the case, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's like, if you were forced to choose between this thing that saved society for, 50 billion and another one that 50 billion, and then another one came along that saved 100 billion, what are you going to throw those 2 out? Just so that you can implement this one. And I don't think anyone is saying that at all. It's just forcing the issue to look at the benefit. Like the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and also the White House has an Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs office that does these analyses, especially any regulation that's going to cost over about $100 million. Started with Reagan's term, when they instituted that. And what they do is analyze what the cost-benefit ratio will be for any of these. And the problem comes around is that after they've done this analysis, it's never looked at again. In other words, it's implemented and not looked at again. And it's interesting because Trump may have gotten this idea from the Brits, because starting in 2011, they had a 1 in, 1 out policy for their regulations, and they liked it so much. Now they have a 1 in, 3 out policy, and so it's interesting because in the Brits they cited all these sort of arcane regulations that they started realizing were there once they were forced to actually look into them. They had this one that said if you work at home in your own business for yourself, you need to abide by all workplace safety and health laws. I mean, you're working at your house, you know. So, it does force you a kind of a hard-boiled look at do these things make sense after they've been implemented, after you've got a few years of experience.
No doubt, no doubt. Well, Jeff, we're going to leave it there. Stay with us, though, before we wrap this one up, because this is a topic we're going to be talking about, I think, with you and Dirk and I and our audience as well going forward, this issue of regulations and what the role of the federal government's to be going forward. I think it's an interesting topic.